Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. And I am back taking that full look at Anvil magazine that I promised you last week. I was pretty busy over the weekend of last week, so I didn't get a real chance to come back to this. But I am ready now to offer a few thoughts on everything else in the magazine, other than the feature story, which I already discussed in my last video. And I want to start by saying what I'm not going to say much about. As odd as that sounds. Letters from the editor, not really interested in that. It's interesting and it's fun to hear from Richard and Daniel and the other people involved, but I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I think they stand pretty well on their own. Ditto for the reviews. I haven't read any of the books reviewed in this, and if I had, I would just make my own video on them. I think these reviews are pretty straightforward and useful if you know what you're looking for already. They do a good job of laying out what's in the story and telling you, how well the author presents it. They don't offer a lot of analysis of it, which is fine. It is a review. It's very hard to do an analysis without getting into spoilers, which is not really the purpose of a review. I know that in the YouTube era, a recap of a story is considered traditional. I don't think that's an important part of a review. I think it is an important part of analysis. And a lot of things that are referred to as reviews on the YouTube world is very much an analysis and not a review. So I think the reviews are good, but I don't intend to go over them I don't intend to look at them as a piece of entertainment, which is what really interests me about Anvil. They are more recommendations and analysis, or not analyses, they're recommendations and descriptions of what kind of story you're going to get in a book. So that's very important. That has its place. I'm glad it's here. I don't have a whole lot to say about it other than that I think all of the reviewers in this magazine did a good job giving you an idea of what a story is like and giving you enough to go on to decide whether you should buy it or not. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the art direction in this magazine, other than to say I think it's pretty good. I'm not sure exactly how many artists were used in here, and I kind of feel it could all be Jacob Kalata, and if it's not, I kind of feel like that should be mentioned on the credits page. Given that Jacob Kalata is just referenced as the graphic designer, I'm going to operate under the assumption he contributed all of this art, and I think it's pretty good. I'm not going to talk about the 10-page preview of Razorfist's comic because that is a incomplete product, and I think it's unfair to discuss it outside of saying it does a pretty good job of promoting the comic as a whole, which is, of course, the purpose of those 10 pages. George Alexopoulos, as always, presents great art. Razorfist's prose is interesting and very reminiscent of the pulp authors that he admires a great deal. Whether that's to your taste or not is up to you. I have some issues with it that may be addressed in the entire story and may not. I will offer more discussion of that when I actually review the comic when I get it. He could be engaged in some very interesting narrative techniques, and he could just not be. And I can't analyze that from the sample offered. So I'm going to just say it looks good. If you enjoy George's art, definitely check out the crowdfunder. And if you don't, well, maybe wait to see what people say about it. What I want to do now is give a couple of minutes feedback on everything else in here. All of the things offered as stories or pieces of entertainment as a complete package. And I'm not going to get into the same depth I did in my discussion of Fleet of Theseus. I don't know as every story stands up to that level of scrutiny, and I was certainly not as excited about any other story to think about it that much as long as I did, but I find most of what's in here to be decent entertainment. Listen, I read a lot of comics, I check out a lot of books from the library, I read them, I enjoy myself, I put them back, and I almost never think of them. There are a handful of stories that I think about a great deal, and part of a large collection of stories like this is to give you a chance to find one or two that you will think about a lot. In this, it was Fleet of Theseus for me. it may not be that for you. There are a couple of other stories that are just as long and do just as interesting stuff. And I will mention those, as I get to them. But I personally did not think about them as much as I thought about Fleet of Theseus. I may have thought about everything else in this magazine together as much as I thought about that one short story. And that's really one of the powers of this kind of anthology collection, because you may not think about Fleet of Theseus in that way. It may not appeal to your personal taste in storytelling. You may not like sci-fi because you have no joy in life. I don't know. But what you get out of this magazine will in part depend on what you bring to it. And I'm sure the way I responded to Fleet of Theseus is a part of what I bring to it. I just don't bring as much that resonates with some of the other things in here. I will mention the things that I really liked, of course, but I just don't have as much to say about everything else in here. One of the things I try and do on this channel is I do try and offer feedback and critique. In most of my reviews, I keep them separate because I do think analysis and critique requires spoilers, and a review does not require, and in fact should not have, spoilers. That's my own personal point of view, and in talking about Anvil, I can't break things apart quite that intensely. So there's just going to be spoilers all over the place. There's not going to be any further warning. I apologize for that, but I just don't think you would have a very good flow of the review if I was constantly saying spoilers, no spoilers, or something like that. And because my thoughts are not as organized on all of these stories, I'm sure something would slip out that is a spoiler, okay? Okay, I apologize for that, but that's the way it is. Let's start with A Thief of Perun, which is our first story by Joshua M. Gonzalez. This story is what I would characterize as sword and sandal. It's set in a fairly primitive society. There's not quite the technology of the high medieval ages. The visual design does suggest that kind of a Bronze Age take. We see a guy here in what looks like a bronze cuirass. That's our antagonist for this story. This is an okay story. The prose is pretty fast-moving. It's relatively short. Our protagonist is looking for a subordinate of his father. He wants to confront his father because he has been wronged by his father in some way, abandoned. The details are all in there, such as they are. And I don't intend to recap all those because they're not really that relevant to the plot. This is mostly about him hunting down this Belshazzar. I assume that's supposed to be pronounced something like the famed sage of the three wise men, Belshazzar or something like that. And he's a crook. He's running a smuggling operation. He's done a lot of bad stuff, but he's very tough and he's a good fighter. And the pursuit and capture of him is pretty straightforward. It follows a progression, kind of like an RPG scenario. Our hero gathers some information. He goes to a remote place. He encounters some dangers along the way, and he has a climactic confrontation with his antagonist. All in all, it's pretty well written. The prose is good. The character's internal dialogue, this is something I mentioned in Fleet of Theseus as well. It's not set off in any way. It's not put in quotation marks. It's not italicized. I found that a little bit jarring, and sometimes when we entered the protagonist's thoughts, I wasn't sure exactly where they started and where they stopped. I don't know if that's a writing issue or a formatting issue. It is something that could use a little work. But I'm not sure if that's Mr. Gonzalez's, falls on Mr. Gonzalez, or if it's just something that Richard needs to think about as he's formatting further issues of Anvil. Maybe he can talk to Richard. Richard can talk to Daniel about that. This is a minor thing, a minor quality of life thing. All in all, this story is mostly about action. I think it does a decent job of that. I think the earlier encounter, in fact, with the salamander, I had a better idea. I had a better ability to understand what was happening in the action scenes. And in the later one, I could have used a little more description. We're going to talk a lot about description of action, I think, in discussing this particular issue of Anvil. I could have used a little more description. And there's one thing that happened. The protagonist, and I'll get his name for you real quick. Lamb. Our protagonist, Lamb, sets some stuff on fire. In fact, again, in this image, you see it. We're told that the fires burn green. I expected that to be relevant. it wasn't. It was a little bit distracting, and I don't know if mentioning that was a necessary detail. You could have just said they were an unnatural fire. They burned with unnatural heat or light or something like that. I was rather distracted by the fact that they were green fire, and I expected that to signify something about what was happening or something. It never turned out to be relevant to understanding the story. So a detail I would have left out or described differently, or I would have actually, what I would have done is I would have made it important to understand what was going on in this particular action scene. That's not what happened. That's okay. I just found it a little distracting. The Affair of the Unquiet Grave by Owen G. Tabbert. I think this was my favorite story after Fleet of Theseus. It's very interesting. It's presented in kind of a Sherlock Holmes fashion as a bit of a memoir presented to us by a paranormal investigator, for lack of a better term. And this story is not actually a detective story. It has the trappings of a detective story. There are interviews with people who know something is going on, but it's actually a tragedy. And like all tragedies, that makes it a morality tale more than a question of who done it, right? When we understand who done it, we understand what the moral flaw of this tragedy is about. I really like this. I like the use of language. It does read a lot like prose from the late 19th century, but it's still intelligible to the modern reader. It really captures a time and a place. The characters are all very interesting. They can be annoying. They can cause problems for the protagonist, but they are all people with understandable and basic human drives. There is no villain in this piece, not because there's gray morality, but because everyone attempts to do the right thing, but there is a tragic flaw in play in this story, and that tragic flaw results in the tragedy. That is what makes a tragedy. There is a person who has something about themselves that they are never able to overcome, and that leads to the downfall of the protagonist. Well, not necessarily the protagonist. Our protagonist survives this, but it leads to the downfall of the person with a tragic flaw, and usually many other people in their surrounding environment. And that is exactly what happens in this story. It's an excellent story that makes you think about character flaws. In this case, an inability to process disappointment and grief. And it says, if you have this flaw, it is going to redound in negative ways to you and everyone around you, whether that's what you wanted or not. This kind of very important moral storytelling is missing from a lot of writing today. And in this case, it's not preachy or moralizing, which is an important line to draw. I really like this. I thought it was a good story. And this is actually something where I don't have like a direct piece of feedback that says this is something you could improve on. I think if I were to say I would have liked to see this in this story, I would have liked to know a little bit more about our protagonist, what he looks like, what part of the country he lives in. This seems to be set in Regency or perhaps Victorian England, and your role in society is a very important part of how people react to you. And while most people react to him as a dabbler in occult arts, which gives him a bad reputation, that doesn't seem to be his full-time profession, and not knowing that and where that would put him in society is unbelievable for the time period. This was how people understood each other in, pretty much any time in the world up until very recently. And I feel like it's kind of missing in this story, but it was still a really good story. I really enjoyed reading it. Good times. Brigands of the Moors by MFR. I don't know what that stands for, but there it is. This is clearly a story that fits into a bigger universe. It actually opens with a profile of our protagonists, which is actually a good thing because our protagonists are not actually who they appear to be at first. We're introduced to two people on a carriage that seem like they will be our protagonists for about a page and a half, but they aren't. So this is from the world of Paladin Dragoon. It gives us a brief write-up and bio of the actual protagonists of the Paladin Dragoon story. I did not read this before reading the story. I didn't want to know too much about these characters until I encountered them in the narrative. Then I came back and I read this. And I would recommend reading this story this way. if you prefer to just know some basic facts and stats about characters, do it, the way it's presented in the magazine. I prefer to learn about characters first through narrative, so I chose to pass on this. I think the story works either way. This is just a personal preference thing. This is intended to be an action-packed introduction, I think, to the protagonists of Paladin Dragoon, and as such, I think it serves pretty well. The carriage driver remains a character through the entire story. He doesn't contribute a whole lot. This is mostly about Sherida and Torshen. I hope I'm saying that that correctly. Is it okay? Torshen the Enduring. There's no umlauts or anything like that, so I'm just going to guess that I got those vowels correct. Torshen is a Drake. Sherida is a lay cleric. I don't know what he's a lay cleric of, and I guess we'll get into that. Paladin Dragoon takes place in a fantasy world that's reminiscent of the late medieval England, it seems, or perhaps late medieval Europe. One of my big critiques of this story is that there is not a clear sense of place. We're told that people have accents, and that these accents are foreign, but we're never told what they tell us about the character, where they're from, what kind of culture that puts them in. And that would have been nice. We know that a couple of people, well, most of the brigands, in fact, have a foreign accent, but I couldn't really place the foreign accent with a real-world accent, so I'm not sure if they're all supposed to be from the same place or what. Putting a name to that accent would have really helped with that. Another issue is, not as much of an issue. One of the guards for the carriage, Mort, has a brogue, which implies something very Scottish or perhaps Irish, and his accent is written in a more Scottish form. So at least I understood that maybe Mort is supposed to be analogous to that society. I don't know if Mort or Mortimer is a traditional Scottish name, though, so that threw me a little bit. Names are cultural, and that is something that I also could have used as kind of an indicator for who's from where or what. I don't see a whole lot of that either. So that said, the sense of the world being a little mushy is perhaps okay for a short story. There's not a lot of room in here for world building, so I'm not holding that too strongly against Paladin Dragoon there. Presumably, when we see more full-length stories, or maybe they already exist, presumably we will have a better picture of the world. So let's talk about the characters. Sherida and Torshen are very much crusading paladins, and I have no problem with that. They have a strong sense of right and wrong. They don't approve of these brigands. Murderers and thieves get very strict punishment from them. In fact, they will probably be killed in combat if Torshen or Sherida catch up with them. Again, I don't have a problem with that. Their adventures are very action-packed. There's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of breathing fire. There's a lot of smashing things with a giant hammer. It feels a little bit Warcrafty. Sheridan is a paladin with a hammer and magic that radiates light. So it does feel a little bit like the Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 3 paladins, which is I'm okay with. I thought those were a pretty great archetype for the paladin. However, much like a Warcraft paladin, at least in this story, what exactly they serve is kind of amorphous. In Warcraft, of course, paladins serve the light, which is just sort of generic good force that heals things. We don't know a whole lot about Sherida and Torshen's religious beliefs. They strive them to punish evil, which is fine. All religions have that prescription to a certain extent. We don't see Sherida does not quote any kind of moral maxims a great deal. And all we know about the Lord that Sherda and Torshen serve is that his sign is a triangle. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to assume this is a religion analogous to the Christian church, or if it's just sort of, generic good religion in a fantasy world kind of a thing. And one of the things that makes me lean towards the latter is that we get references to both Styx in the form of Stygian darkness and Mammon, which is one of those is Greek, of course, and the other one is Christian. And I'm not sure if there's an acknowledged metaphysic or if there's, there kind of has to be if there's magic and magic granted by deities. So I don't know if Mammon is an actual person, Styx is an actual place, or perhaps refers to an actual person. I would have liked to, since our main character is of a religious nature, I would have liked to understand just a little bit more of the religious landscape he lives in. And I know that it's just a fantasy story about a guy kicking the butt of, evil because he feels like God drives him to that. And if that's what floats your boat, that's fine. If that's all you want from your story, I wanted to understand what exactly makes this man different from any other religion in his world. I would have liked to see him maybe quote some religious tenets, maybe mention some scriptures, something like that. It would have helped me get a little more invested in the character. This is the Bajor problem. I don't know if anyone's heard me talk about it before, but the fact that the Bajorans have a religion that has no identifiable tenets, and like Klingons and Vulcans have a better described religion than the Bajoran veneration of the prophets in Star Trek. And that really bugs me because Bajorans are supposed to be the really religious people. Anyways, really religious characters need some kind of clearly definable religious thing beyond just making a symbol and being driven to destroy evil. It's true that everyone has an innate sense of what is good and evil, and a sense of what is good can drive you to oppose evil. That's all fine. But if it's going to come in a specifically religious context, I personally feel like I need some sense of what that religious context is. Another thing I'm not going to talk about, I had forgotten about this till I flipped past it. There are a couple of reprints of stories submitted for Iron Age Media story prompts. I'm not going to talk about those. They're available on the Iron Age Media website. Go and read them if you're interested. These two stories are pretty good examples of good stuff from that website. But again, I don't want to replace that website, and I don't have a whole lot of thoughts to offer on them. So I think it's better for people to go and read them themselves. Okay, we have Chivalheart, a solo RPG by Harry Stamford. This is basically a choose-your-own-adventure story with some very light board game mechanics. I wouldn't go so far as to call this an RPG. You can select one of the dice rolls, either survival, charisma, or athletics, to specialize in. That makes it easier to succeed at them. And when you are called on to make one of these checks, you roll 2d6. If your specialized skill check is the one that you're making, if your 2d6 are 4 or higher, you succeed. If it is not that skill, instead you need to roll an 8 or higher. So pretty simple mechanic. It's basically a choose your own adventure story with some dice rolling on top of choosing which part of the story you turn to. I think this is okay. It was certainly fun to kind of flip back and forth and relive that choose your own adventure experience. I read a ton of those when I was younger. I think that as a choose your own adventure, the design here is pretty average. There are those parts where you flip to one part of the scenario and it's just, hey, this happens and you see this thing, but there's nothing else to do here, so go back to where you just came from. I understand that's part of the design for these things. I think that I would have had fewer of those given the real estate available in Anvil magazine. This takes up, I think, 7, 8 pages? Let's see, 83 to 96. Okay, so a dozen pages, 14 pages really, right? Yeah. 14 pages, and that's fine. The story is, nothing terribly remarkable. It's, you show up in a new area, you poke around some, you talk to some people. Eventually, you're asked to help save the girl, and either you do or you don't. There's no character progression here, which is unsurprising. It's so short. If you were, maybe if this whole book was a scenario, or whole magazine rather, you might get some places for character progression and stuff like that. All well and good. I can't really fault it for what it is, and I think that it shows some chops. The designer could definitely write a good RPG scenario if he had some more space. I don't think this is the best venue for it. I think it's solidly mid. I don't mean that as an insult. I think he did as well as he could with what he has available to him. But yeah, in order to get something really interesting, I think you would need some more space. I do have one critique to offer. At the beginning of the scenario, as I said, you are given a chance to specialize in one of the 3 skills your character possesses. And throughout the scenario, for the most part, your opportunities to use those skills are even. And that's fine. You can, if you're paying attention as you're reading the descriptions, you can say, well, if I go this way, I may get a chance to use my skill and perhaps get some rewards for that. But if I go this other way, I'll have to use some other skill. Like if you go to the tavern to talk to people, you're probably going to be rolling charisma a lot. Whereas if you go across the bridge into the mountains, there's some good chances for survival there, right? So that kind of affected my decisions as I was going through the first time. And I was pleased to see that by and large, my intuitions were correct. Once I was done with my actual play of the scenario, I went back and I read every entry to get a better sense of what was going on. There are plenty of opportunities for you to use every skill. I think they're pretty well balanced. There are chances to lose hit points, of which you have 3. And there are chances to get items that prevent you losing hit points. And again, these are pretty well distributed in each area and behind each skill. So I don't have anything to complain about there. But the end of the scenario, there's only one way to reach the end of the scenario. And in order to get through that, you have to succeed at an athletics check. If you didn't choose athletics as your specialty skill, it is very hard to complete this scenario, especially if you've wandered around a bunch and accidentally lost some hit points. There's no indication that athletics is going to be the primary skill in this scenario. You're going to need athletics to finish it. So I felt that was a little bit unfair to the player. I think there should have been multiple ways to reach the ending of the scenario. And again, I recognize that space is a constraint. I think that some of the quote-unquote dead end entries where you just go somewhere and see a thing and then come back to where you started could have been dropped to perhaps create a second avenue to reach the end of the scenario. Something that is not locked behind athletics. Now, if you arrive there with full hit points and perhaps an item to restore a hit point, you may think that, hey, I can roll an 8 or higher. Well, let me tell you, that's what I had. I had 4 shots at the end of that, and I didn't make any of those rolls. So I think that, statistically, that is unlikely. Let me start by saying that. But I was kind of disappointed. I think I did a pretty good job of exploring the scenario before I got to the end of it, that there was only one way to reach the end, and I couldn't get to the end in a way that was tailored to my decision at the beginning. So there is that. And unfortunately, this is a scenario with not a lot of replayability. Once you've gone through it once, hey, you're done. I mean, you know what skill you need at the end, and you might as well just take that and get to the end as fast as possible. So I would have liked that option to be there. Unfortunately, it was not. And that's all I can really say about that. Let's see. Was there anything else in here? I have a few more reviews. Codename Ghost by William Donnelly. This is an interesting cyberpunk story about a grizzled veteran opposing a dictatorial government at some point in the future. And Grizzly has an understudy, and they don't exactly have a buddy cop dynamic, but it's similar to a buddy cop dynamic. Um, and it's a fine story if you enjoy the kind of cyberpunk dystopia, rebel against the machine kind of stories. It's not my cup of tea. I thought it was pretty good from the perspective of prose. It does probably the best job of describing action of anything I read in here. There's a lot of sliding and near misses and impulsive decisions that you just barely pull back from, or things like that. So from that point of view, it's pretty interesting. It does not delve too much into the general cyberpunk themes, which I'm okay with. I'm not actually a huge fan of cyberpunk as a genre. I find transhumanism to be a promise that people have been making since alchemy was a thing, and it never pans out. So I view the fears of the cyberpunk, or at least transhumanism, to be a little bit overblown. But the sense of an old soldier trying to do something important at the end of his life is actually in this story pretty well. That's something that is hard to write. Having tried to write it myself with the story Pewter and Iron, it can be kind of hard to present that kind of cynicism in a way that doesn't set you against the character. And I think we, by and large, get that with Grizzly. But I think, I'm not sure, but I think this is really a story about what prolonged conflict takes out of you. We see child soldiers. We see a populace that is really beaten down and kind of held in contempt by both sides of the conflict. We see people fighting drugged out of their mind. And I know these are aspects, especially in the modern era of urban warfare. I just didn't feel a whole lot just having them presented to me. I don't really feel like Grizzly goes on an arc in this. He feels very cynical at the beginning and very cynical at the end. He does take on a new apprentice at the end of the story, and perhaps that's something we're meant to be optimistic about, but that's not the sense I got. So I don't really feel like in presenting these things, I was told something about what Grizzly is going to what Grizzly is aiming to get out of his opposition, because he's been in opposition for a long time, and he seems pretty pessimistic about it the whole way through. So I guess I was looking for a character turn that tells me this is where this character is going to wind up, even if he doesn't get there by the end of the story. I never got that, and so I had a hard time. Locking down anything about this story other than that it's presenting me with a cyberpunk dystopia, which is fine as the beginning of a story, but it's not really where I expect that kind of story to end. And when that was where we ended, I was a little disappointed, to be honest. Hopefully, Mr. Donnelly will give us a little bit more of that in the future if we see anything from him in the pages of Anvil magazine again. But that brings us to the end of the magazine. Look at that. A couple of minutes on each story or complete piece of entertainment outside Fleet of Theseus. And we're about a half hour in, and I'm out of things to say. So hopefully the people who are published in this, who stumble across this, find something useful in that. For the rest of you, maybe you are more inspired to pick this up. I did really enjoy it. I really liked The Affair of the Unquiet Grave and, of course, The Fleet of Theseus. So I think those two stories together are more than strong enough to recommend picking this up, at least in digital, an opportunity which you will have in the very near future, even if you didn't back the crowdfunder. And also, you can get the physical item in the crowdfunder for the next one, which is linked down in the video description. So give that a look at if you are interested in reading some of these stories and some other great stories coming in Volume 2, including one by yours truly, which I can vouch for at least being pretty good, if not great. But I will leave that ultimately up to your evaluation if you check it out. Let me know what you thought of this video and volume number 1 of Anvil magazine down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.